Kelly Asche, Center for Rural Policy and Development. Kelly's a really smart guy that's got some great information. I've known Kelly for a really long time. I knew Kelly back when he spent his nights and weekends scrubbing out kegs. So make sure you ask about that in the Q&A. But I'm not going to give a lot of background. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly because he's got a lot of great stuff to say. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me. I speak rather loud, so if this is too loud, just let me know. I'm trying not to blow your ears out. But my presentation today is just going to try to round up a lot of different things, and it's centered around this idea that we need people, not jobs. And that's kind of the main theme we're going to be pushing, and I'm sure you all know that fact, but I'm going to be giving an overview of some of the strategies that are being implemented in rural Minnesota and being implemented in Otter County and how it all connects together. I have to give the obligatory, what is the Center for Rural Policy and Development? We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are a nonpartisan research organization. We were actually created by the Minnesota State Legislature back in the late 90s. We synthesize data, gather data, do survey work, we do all kinds of analysis, and give it mostly to legislators, but also county commissioners, EDAs, anybody else that can find information or wants information regarding rural Minnesota. And that's all we focus on is rural Minnesota. And as any rural organization, we try to do a lot with very little, so there's 3 of us across the state. I'm out of New London, Minnesota, in Kandiyohi County. My other colleague, Marnie Werner, she's out of Mankato, and then our boss, the CEO, Executive Director, Julie Tesh, she's out of Waseca, Minnesota, actually a small town called Waldorf. She lives on her family farm there. If you are interested, these are our most latest research reports. Just go to ruralmn.org if you're interested. We do a broad swath of topics regarding rural Minnesota. We try to do about 5 to 6 each year. If we're lucky, Marnie and I try our hardest to get out as much as we can. Okay, today, this is 3 things we're going to talk about, and I'm going to fly through this stuff, but I think it'll resonate with a lot of you and provide you some data and kind of some concrete ideas, and also kind of, I think, affirm or confirm some of the things you guys are doing in this county as actually being in the right direction, even though they're relatively new ideas and maybe a bit uncomfortable for a lot of folks because it is so different. We're going to talk about a new labor force reality, just a real quick overview of the labor force numbers. Is it real in migration to rural Minnesota? Just what the most recent kind of data is showing, and it looks good for rural Minnesota, and Otter County is really primed to benefit from it. And a shift in economic development, and that's getting this shift away from job recruitment and retainment towards people recruitment and retainment, and how different that looks. So let's just start out with talking about our unemployment labor force. So in Minnesota, we have a really great economic system. We've had it for a long time. So we have the top 5 lowest unemployment rate. We've had that since the 1970s. Top 5 highest labor force participation rate across the United States. Top performing state during recessions. This happened during the Great Recession from 2008 to 2012. And just during the pandemic, that little blip we had, we were the top performing state during that time as well. And we also have the 5th most diverse economy. And this is one that's really important to me because we are none of these things. We are not the top 5 lowest, we are not the top 5 highest, and we're not a top performing state if we don't have a diverse economy, and you do not have a diverse economy if you do not have everything outside of the 7-county metro. So if you're ever looking for a talking point about why rural Minnesota or greater Minnesota is important, that's probably the #1 key point if you're trying to make an economic argument about it. So what may threaten how awesome Minnesota is? Right now it's lack of people, and this is the entire Midwest, but we are severely lacking people in Minnesota. We're a slow growth state. We have been for a long time. Labor force growth has been decreasing for 2 decades, and actually during the pandemic was our first actual decline in the labor force in modern history. We're terrible at keeping our youth, and this is a statewide issue. As much as we want to focus on rural areas of keeping our youth, the Twin Cities is just as bad. They just happen to get the youth from our rural regions in a few other states. But as far as their own youth, they're pretty terrible at it. So I'm going to talk about unemployment and labor force, and this is always kind of the tension, right? Like somebody will argue about low unemployment rates, and then somebody will pipe up, yeah, that's because nobody's working, right? And then you talk about labor force. So let's just kind of clear the air, because both are right. But if we need to talk about them in an accurate and correct way, let's talk about this. So I'm going to be talking about unemployment. And unemployment actually is folks participating in the labor force. That's the key difference. So if you're unemployed, that means you are not working and you're absent from a job, vacation, ill. You might have been laid off for a winter, a lot of seasonal work, particularly in northern Minnesota. Or you might be on layoff, awaiting recall, and you're actively looking in the last 4 weeks and available for work. That means you're unemployed, but you're still in the labor force. That's what that means. So we're going to talk about that first. These are the planning regions. You're going to see some colors on my charts. Just so you know, this is what the colors represent in terms of different regions. And obviously, Otter Tail's Northwest, huge region, pretty nuanced across it. And I'll provide some data for Otter Tail as well. So this is the unemployment rate since 2000. And as you can see, we obviously had a great recession there from 2008, 2012. You had that spike, steady declines, a quick little spike during the pandemic, and then just the bottom dropped out. And we're at the lowest unemployment rates we've ever seen since we've been recording unemployment rates in Minnesota. In Northwest Minnesota, 2.7%. We want to get a little more granular. Here's the entire state. The actual lowest unemployment rate is in the very southwest corner of the state, Rock County, at 1.5%. But Otter Tail up here, I did your whole economic development region just so you can kind of see a comparison across the region. You guys are between 1.5 and 2%, 2.5%. These are historically low numbers. There are not a lot of folks on the unemployment rolls to grab from to fill your labor force. So let's talk about the labor force then, because we have had a lot of people leave the labor force over the past few years. And so let's kind of get a sense of what that looks like. This is the total number in Otter Tail County of folks participating in your labor force. And as you can see, there's been very little change. You have just been a flat line since, well, probably since the early 2000s. But you are not growing and you are not declining. This is actually pretty good news. A lot of rural areas, particularly when you get in the Southwest, have been declining. And I'll show you a chart on that in just a second. If we were to look at it every year, you can see this is Otter Tail County again. From 2012 to 2013, you had 179 people join your labor force. 232 the next year. You can kind of see a little bit decline in 2018. And then you can see during the pandemic, you lost about 800, 900 people. And then over the last year, you gained 216. This is pretty darn good, honestly. Even though you guys are just kind of flatlining in terms of your labor force, you're not seeing huge declines, which is a huge win for a lot of rural regions. But just to give you the scope of how much we don't have people in our labor or are coming into our area, Otter Tail County ended 2022 with 715 more people than the labor force in 2012. So over the last 10 years, you've added just over 700 people. So that's not a lot. That's, again, essentially pretty much zero, particularly according to how much economic growth is happening across the state. I did it by planning region just so you kind of get a sense of where you guys stand. You guys are in the Northwest region there, and Northwest overall does all right. So you can see lost 800, kind of a little bit of a roller coaster there. Huge drop during the pandemic, and then 1,300. So you guys gained a few hundred there. Well, I should say since 2012, this entire region has gained about 2,000 people over the last 10 years into its labor force. Not bad. You guys have gained 700. So according to the region, you're doing really, really, really well. But you can see other regions. Northeast is actually operating with almost 5,000 less people in the labor force than 10 years ago. And in Southwest, 10,000 less people. I just had to present down there on Tuesday regarding how many high school students they're losing to South Dakota and St. Cloud and Mankato. And they're really, really, really trying hard to figure out how to increase their labor force. So you guys are doing really, really good. This is good news, even though the numbers aren't like super exciting, right? But in comparison, you guys are doing great. And I wanted to choose, this is just change in labor force, so if we were to compare where you were right before the pandemic to right after the pandemic, from 2019 to 2012, like we can look at all the numbers we want, the percentages actually mean a lot in rural areas. And you can see you guys are EDR 4 here, and you guys lost about 3,500, you have about 3,500 from 2021 to 2019. That was only about a 3% loss, way better than say EDR 6W, which is like Lac-Aparel, Swift County, Yellow Medicine, some of those, they lost 1,600, so not as many as you, but that was 7% of their labor force. And so they're really, really struggling down there. That's a big deal. So again, you guys are performing really, really well. Now, folks are always kind of like, well, you know, there's always these arguments, who's dropping out of the labor force, right? It's all these young punks playing video games, hanging out in their parents' basements, right? There probably is some of that. I'd probably do it if I could. But who dropped out of labor force? If we look at the data, it was quite clear in rural areas and in this region, individuals 55 and plus were a pretty big part of that, and we'll talk a few reasons about that. And then women in the workforce dropped out in particularly related to healthcare, and I'm sure some of you have friends or know people or might be married to somebody that just got out of that business when the pandemic was hitting, because it was hard. It was super hard. And so why leaving the labor force? We're not able to have focus groups with these people, obviously, but there has been some research coming out, and there's a lot of different factors, right? So if you're looking for your smoking gun factor on why people are leaving the labor force, you're not going to find it. But it's kind of a lot of life circumstances. So one was need for childcare. We've seen this both in terms of the spouse leaving the labor force to provide childcare because they couldn't find it, but also grandparents leaving the labor force to provide childcare for their grandchildren. We saw it on both sides. So again, I think it hit women kind of hard, as well as 55 and older who might have had grandchildren. Fear of COVID-19, right? So there was a lot of that, particularly in the healthcare industry and anyone that was 55 and older. Also, I think some of the mandates around having to wear masks, there was a lot of 55 and older that just couldn't deal with it, right? Had to leave the labor market. There's just all these different kinds of reasons that play into this. Cultural changes at work. I don't think this gets enough attention. Maybe you guys have some spouse or friends, but folks that all of a sudden you're working from home and you're 55 and older, you're not used to it, you're used to clocking in at your job. You don't want to sit behind a computer that maybe you don't even have with terrible internet to try and do your job, right? So there was a lot of things that happened there, as well as, I know it sounds crazy, but wage increases. Particularly over the last few years, it's starting to change now, but really went to new entry folks that were coming into the labor force, and the wages for the folks that had been working for 20-some years didn't bump up with them. And I think there was a bit of kind of like, well, you know, I don't know, what's a good British term, like piss off, you know, like, I don't know, like, I always listen to the BBC, and whenever someone gets fired, what do they say? Sacked. He was sacked. I just love that. So I try and use it as much as I can. All right. So anyway, we have a lot of things going on. Labor force, we had that kind of drop out from underneath us while having low unemployment rate, while having all these demographic changes of people leaving the labor force, which leaves us with a whole lot of job vacancies. And I know you all know about job vacancies here. But I just want to give you some data to kind of show you how severe this is. And then I want to transition towards like how different of a time this is and what that means for strategies. So 2021, in the state of Minnesota, there were 0.4 job seekers per vacancy. So we didn't even have a whole body for every job that was available in 2021. This is the job vacancy rate. So this is the number of job vacancies in each of those planning regions as a percent of the total filled jobs. The higher that percentage, the harder it is to fill those jobs, right? We consider 3 to 5% to be a healthy percentage, which means you have job opportunities for people in your region, while at the same time people are applying for those jobs, like you have a labor pool to pick from. As you can see in Northwest, you guys are at 8.6%. Northeast is at 9.4%, with darn near 10% job vacancy rate. That is absolutely bonkers, and again, I keep reiterating this, there is no historical precedent to compare this to, nothing. We have nothing in modern history to kind of talk about, well, we've been through this before and this is what we did. We just don't have that. And so this is really, really unprecedented, and this is significant. And it's interesting, if you ever hear, I do go on tangents, so stop me if I'm going too long, but I get really irritated because some people, I read articles and they'll be like, oh, rural areas lost jobs again. No, we didn't lose those jobs. We lost the people filling those jobs. Those jobs are still there. There's just no one filling them. And so if you ever get into a conversation or somebody that thinks they know what they're talking about is spewing off crap like that, let them know like that is just not true at all. And I'm tired of hearing it. God. I don't know how many articles in the Star Tribune or whatever I got to read and talking about rural areas. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. All right. So the data is quite clear. Job vacancies are high. The gap in wages between the 7-county metro and rural Minnesota has actually narrowed quite a bit, largely due to our areas having job vacancies be an issue. This is since the pre-pandemic we've been dealing with job vacancies in rural areas. It's just lately that the 7-county metro has gotten a little bit more pressure, and now they're kind of increasing their wages along with rural areas. But that gap has narrowed quite a bit. And I put up here a significantly larger number of job vacancies are full-time, significantly larger number of offering health insurance benefits. Like businesses employers are doing what they can to try and fix this issue as well. They're increasing wages, they're offering benefits, they're doing everything that you would expect in a natural market for them to do. And it is happening. Also, I would like to add job requirements used as a lever for applicant pool. If anybody ever, again, is talking about like, well, these are all low-skilled jobs, that's not the case at all. When this data comes out, they always say, all right, how many requirements are required for experience and things like that to get the job. And over the last few years, like those requirements have disappeared. But it's only because they're trying to increase their labor pool. It has nothing to do with the actual experience required for that job. Because I think there's probably employers in here, right, where you're like, does your blood flow? We'll hire you, right? Does your heart beat? We'll take you on. So we're having a fundamental shift take place, and Otter County has been really doing a really nice job at leading this kind of effort from business recruitment to people recruitment. And this is a really big fundamental shift that I think we're still coming to terms with in terms of our policies and in terms of how we're talking about it in our communities. And these are some uncomfortable conversations because I think a lot of government entities and even partnerships between for-profit and private industries are having to have discussions that just they're not used to. How do we provide daycare? How do we provide housing? Who's going to put what kind of money into this to help fix the issue, right? And that's a tough conversation. And so no one should feel bad that this is taking a little longer, that we're not always having success, because right now we don't even have a tool set to deal with this issue because most of the tool set is involved around job recruitment. So it used to be about tax incentives, which are still important, don't get me wrong, infrastructure investments and focus on labor force, where now we're talking about how do we collaborate to build housing programs, childcare, how do we use visitor strategies to make our place seem like a great place to live so we can try and recruit them in, healthcare, current resident engagement, investments in natural amenities, and focus on quality of life issues. These are all starting to play a role in these conversations. So before kicking off into kind of what that shift looks like, I just wanted to give a quick update on what the migration patterns are looking like, because as much trauma and challenges that the pandemic kind of gave to us, it also has presented us an opportunity as a rural area that I think we can at least hopefully discuss in a positive way without having to also acknowledge that it was a very challenging time with a lot of death. Two drivers of population change. So anybody that's looking at population, it's so important to think about who's coming in, who's coming out, and where population comes from. There's really two places, right? It can be natural change. So you're going to have a negative natural change if you're having more deaths than births in your area. And then you have to talk about migration change. Are you having more in-migration or out-migration? These are the only two things that influence population change in our areas. I'm going to be providing some more charts. This is a state demographer's way of kind of cutting up and trying to find like a nice, I don't know what you call it, like range of rural versus urban. Most of Minnesota is neither purely urban or purely rural. Most of Minnesota is somewhere in between. You can see Otter County is kind of considered a town-rural mix. If you're under it and want the definitions, just let me know, but it's not that important. But you can see a lot of this area is town-rural mix, and obviously with Clay County, you're going to have a little bit of that more urban influence. So let's talk about natural change, and this is by Rukin. I put Otter County on the end here. What this is saying is that that red bar is the annual natural change from 2010 to 2019. The orange bar is where we're at this decade per year. And as you can see, Otter County last decade was having 27 more deaths than births per year. So far this year, it's 98 more deaths than births. And this is going to be the ongoing thing and the ongoing challenge that rural areas are going to have to deal with because of our demographics changing so much, is that you guys are running against, and it sounds terrible, please don't be offended by this, but you're running against deaths more than anything. So you're going to have to try to get migration in here to make up for a lot more death because of your aging population. And again, I know it's dark, but we got to have an honest conversation about it, right? Entirely rural, as you can see, all those counties are having, so far this decade, 437 more deaths than births, 1,100 for town-rural mix, 310 urban town. As you get more urban, you're going to have more births than deaths, just because they have younger population. They might have more of a BIPOC population, and those populations tend to have more children, things like that. But as you can see, everybody's doing a little bit worse than last decade. This is going to be the continual trend over the next 20 to 30 years, is that we're going to be dealing with that a lot more. There's going to be a lot more deaths than births. So let's look at migration change. So Otter Tail County here again, last decade you were dealing with about 195 more people coming into the county than leaving the county. That's good, that's real good. This decade so far, 248, so that's an increase. That's great, because you've had more deaths than births, you need that in-migration to help kind of level that off. And as you can see, entirely rural switched. Now this decade, last decade they were losing 276 in out-migration, now they're gaining 181 so far this decade. Town-rural mix is huge. They've lost per year 987 last decade, now they're gaining about 3,000 per year. Urban-town-rural mix, 6,300, up from 205 last decade, and then look at that, entirely urban. They've been losing 14,000 for out-migration. It's a total flip from last decade. And that's due to migration, housing costs. I think all the uproar around the George Floyd issue just all kind of exasperated and created this perfect storm of people leaving entirely urban areas. So what does that mean for total population change? And as you can see, Otter Tail County, although you were gaining 161 last decade, you're only gaining 148, but still that's good. Don't worry about that. That's essentially you're staying even despite the fact that you're losing more people to death than birth. So that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. Entirely rural, they cut their total population loss in half. And then you get to that town-rural mix. They were 217, now they're gaining about 2,000 population each year. That urban-town-rural mix, about 6,400 compared to 3,700. And then you can see the entire shift in the entirely urban areas where they used to be gaining 33,000 and now they're losing about 2,500 so far this decade per year. So anyway, a lot of data. As you can see, this is the population change since 2010. Otter Tail County right around that 2 to 5% more than you had in 2010. That's great. You guys are doing good work here. Okay, now let's start talking about that shift in, going through population change is always kind of like, I don't know. It's not that exciting unless you have a story behind it. So let's talk a little bit about the story. So we're first going to talk about resident recruitment and retention. How am I doing, Sarah, on time? I just want to check. I should take my phone out. Okay, great. Yeah, we're flying right along. I talk fast too, so. Resident recruitment and retention. So this is kind of a newer thing. Otter Tail County, I have to admit, you guys have been kind of on the leading edge about it. I've probably presented some variations of this presentation probably over 40 times so far this year, because this is kind of what everybody's talking about, is how do we fill our labor force. This is one of the strategies, resident recruitment and retention. So I always use this. Is anybody familiar with Greater MSP? Yeah, some of you. So it's a pretty I would say well-resourced organization in the 7-county metro that essentially all they do is promote and provide information about how great the 7-county metro is to live, to raise a family, to find work, to have nightlife, things like that. That's what this organization does. It's called Greater MSP. And I call it rural envy because I think a lot of rural regions are kind of figuring out we want something like this too. There are some people recruitment efforts in Minnesota occurring. Obviously, you guys are one of the big ones. This is an old, outdated map, so before your guys' campaign got started. But I didn't throw this in here because I'm in Otter Tail County. This is actually with me all the time because, as far as I know, and I haven't looked back on this research in a while, Otter Tail County is the only county in which they're paying for a position to do this work. The Rural Rebound Coordinator, as far as I know, there's no other county doing this. And it's really spectacular. And every time I bring it up, other counties are now like, hey, we should get on board with this. And we show them the website and stuff. So good work on this, because this is a big deal. And this is kind of what everybody's trying to figure out how to do. And it's not based on anything I want to say like that isn't based in research. This actually is a marketing campaign and an idea, this whole resident recruitment retention, around this idea that yes, we lose our young people. Rural regions do. A lot of out-migration to colleges and things like that. But since the 1970s, rural regions have had an in-migration of 30 to 49-year-olds. Otter Tail County could probably extend that to 30 to 59 to 69-year-olds because of your lakes and recreation. You guys have been set up really, really well. You have a lot of assets. But the idea behind recruitment and retention isn't necessarily how do we keep our young people, but how do we recruit the people that have just turned 30 or 35 or 40 and looking for a change, a slower pace of life, and those types of ideas. And it's based on this research. Many of you have probably heard Ben Winchester at the University of Minnesota Extension, Brain Gain Resident Recruitment Campaign. That's the research it's based on. And one of the interesting things, and this goes back to why recruitment of jobs isn't where it used to be in terms of priority is when they did focus groups, and this is down in EDR 6W, so Swift County, Lacaparo, Yellow Medicine, where population loss is a pretty severe issue. They did, and they asked people, they pulled them aside, they hold focus groups, and they said, why did you move to this area? Top 3 reasons: affordable housing, small class sizes, and then this overarching theme of quality of life. And it usually contained things like, I wanted to, I don't know, be near the woods, to be able to my hunting land. I wanted to have dinner around the table. I wanted a slower pace of life. I wanted my kids to be able to bike around the block and just not have to worry about it so much. And so that all went under quality of life. Jobs, interestingly, wasn't even in the top 5 reasons when they did the focus groups. Most of them either had a job that they were coming to, it wasn't that important. They were going to try and figure out when they got there. Unless you're an immigrant and refugee population, then it was a bigger deal. But outside of those populations, jobs wasn't even in the top 5, which is very surprising because traditional economic development used to say, if we have jobs, they will come. And now we have the jobs and we're still trying to figure out how to get them to come. The other thing I would say is, one thing as rural regions we really struggle with is, what's the region that we should be talking about? And I think it's always important to look at it, and I think it's what you guys do so well is you're talking about your entire county and your region. People live regionally, they don't live locally anymore, for many different reasons and factors. But if you were, the University of Minnesota Extension always kind of does this quiz where they're like, put a dot where you live, right, and then put an X where you work, and the X might be like 15 to 30 miles from where you live, or on the dot right now, right? Things have changed. And then draw a circle around where you shop, and that circle might be like a 45-mile radius. And then you say draw a circle around where you play, and that circle gets even bigger. The idea is that we don't have to have every single town in our counties and in our regions be the one-stop shop for everything for their residents, but we can do that as a region. And that's probably the most important thing, is that we are not trying to be everything for everyone. But how do we fit into this puzzle of how people live in our area and in our region? I use this, promoting and engaging. This is Get Rural MN, so this is down in that upper Minnesota Valley, EDR 6W. That RDC in particular, they just had a really nice graphic about what are we talking about when we're talking about resident recruitment and retention, what types of pieces need to be compiled together. And as you can see, it's a pretty disparate group of information. We're talking about housing, employment opportunities, things to do, family essentials. Like, how do we get this into one spot so we can put it out there and promote it? And not only like have it on a website, but probably more importantly, and it was a frustration that EDR 6W RDC brought up, was that trying to get it to their businesses, because they still had so many employers that were really trying to sell their job to someone, but forgetting to sell the community. And we are living at a point where potential employees are comparing communities and places to live, not necessarily comparing against jobs. And so as employers, we really need to start thinking about how we work together with our communities and regions to promote this as an entire package, rather than just as having a great job. Obviously, it comes with its own challenges, right? So as anybody in Otter County, Eric Osberg and you guys can know, you're building a network from scratch because this stuff hasn't been done before. How do we bring all these people together? Who's responsible for this? The county in Otter County said, no, we're responsible for this along with tourism, so we're gonna take this on. A lot of other people are trying to figure that out. Is this an RDC level? Is this a workforce development issue? Is this just tourism? What does this look like, and who takes control and who pays for it? That's a big question that needs to be answered for a lot of areas. Negative narrative and perceptions. This one is always funny to me because obviously we get it from both sides, right? I feel like we get it from metro areas having negative perceptions about rural areas, but damn it if we don't get it also from our local community members having negative perceptions about their communities. Drives me nuts, but it is a thing and it's something that needs to be conquered. And then the diversity skill set required for these initiatives. You're asking somebody to be a journalist, a video editor, a recorder, a promoter, a marketing person. They should know how to put pictures together and edit them, right? Like, that's a pretty diverse skill set to have of someone. And I know there's people out there that can do it, but you're looking for a little bit of a needle in a haystack, I think, to some extent. So yeah, that's resident recruitment retention. So now that we're all doing that work, right? And I think Otter County's kind of run into this in some other areas. We're seeing this in migration of people. We're seeing resident recruitment initiatives kind of take place. There's some interest in living rural. And now we're out of housing, right? So now we're kind of up against this housing crunch. And I know that's why you're all here. I don't think I'm going to present you guys any new information, but hopefully package it in a way where you know kind of how it fits into the grand scheme of things, as well as hoping you can take some of the talking points to local leaders, legislators, or whoever to help fund what you guys are up to for resources. And I apologize, I forgot to change this slide. I presented this entire presentation in my county, Ojai County. I'm in New London, and I'm literally trying to get them to like, you should have Eric Osborne come down, just tell him what you do. And so this slide's from that presentation. My apologies. But one thing that we need to get clear, and again, I think this points to, if you guys were to look at your population, your population change, right? You're like, ah, we're pretty stable. Why do we need so much housing if our population isn't changing that quickly? It's because housing isn't linked to population, it's linked to households. And the size of households has changed so much in our rural areas that that's the biggest piece, right? So I use this as an example. If we were to take all those entirely rural counties that I showed you, and you look at their change in population since 1970, they've declined 21% in population. But the number of households has increased by 9%. That's why housing is such a weird issue, particularly in rural areas. We started talking to legislators about this in 2017, 2018, like, hey, there's a housing shortage in rural areas. And they're like, what? How can you have a housing shortage and lose people? Like, that makes no sense to us. And so this is a key thing, is to recognize, and I use Ojai County here, change in population since 1970. It's increased by 43%, but the number of households has doubled that at 83%. I hope that makes sense, yeah? You guys could start recruiting a whole lot of Catholics. Change your birth rates. Is that still a Catholic thing? They still don't wear protection? Is that pretty sure it's, my wife's Irish Catholic, used to be. Well, I still, you never lose it, the guilt goes on forever. So, one thing that's really interesting about a housing cycle and about housing is, so a lot of folks are really focused on how do we build more workforce housing. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes I think we get too stuck on the idea of having a direct solution to the problem. We have to have housing for workforce, so let's build workforce housing. The other thing we would argue is that rural areas have a bit of a housing cycle issue as well. We call it, Ben Winchester, who I took this from, calls it churn. We kind of started calling it normal house life cycle, right? But if you were to kind of like draw a diagram and you were to say, okay, as people age, your housing cycle, you know, in their 20s, maybe they want single or multifamily rent, starter home, something like that. So you build multifamily rentals. People in their 30s, they probably want to start getting a single family own, right? So then you build starter homes or single family housing. I won't go that way. And then you leave those multifamily rentals behind. Those people are getting older, so they leave those empty for the next group of people. And then you might upgrade in your 40s, right? You might downsize in your 50s. You're talking about maybe assisted living in your 70s. And so you're building all these things for that, and then you're leaving those units behind for the next group of people to fill that spot, right? That's what we call like a really healthy housing life cycle. And rural regions, and I would argue that Otter County, this is one of the things you guys are trying to fight off, is we seem to have single or multifamily rent and then single family own, and then maybe they go to assisted living, or you just pass away in your home, right? Like, that's kind of all we have. And when you have that, you're not building a lot of new units and you're not leaving much behind. So in rural areas, we have a very high percentage of older households that are still living in single family housing, which you don't see as much in metropolitan areas. So you're just not seeing that churn. And what we would argue is that those single family homes that are occupied by aging households are probably your workforce housing, or at least a part of what workforce housing should be, because they are going to be more affordable. They're older, maybe they need a little work, right? That kind of needs to be part of the conversation. And part of the issue is that you don't have a lot of, I call them assisted living, but also a patio style, one level housing that a lot of aging households might want to be in. There isn't a lot of that being developed in rural Minnesota. In New London, where I live, we got a piece of land and we gave it to a developer for $1 to build those single level patio style homes, and they were sold out immediately with a wait list of about 28 people. They just went bonkers, and it opened up some of the housing in the area that was quickly gobbled up by younger families and people that were looking for housing to raise a family in. And yeah, I won't go there. And so I was gonna say there's also, like, we had a couple divorcees move into the single family or the patio style home, so it does work for that too, if you have a lot of that in your county. But yeah, so keep an eye and think about that as being part of the solution for housing in general. Now, why is increasing construction costs? I know I could probably, how many of you are contractors or carpenters or builders in the room? Yeah, a few of you, yeah. So you guys know this well, right? So cost of material, land, and prep is up. Labor shortages is still one of the bigger deals, I would argue, as well as we still haven't recovered from the Great Recession in 2008. We still have less carpentry and development and construction businesses than we did in 2008. We still haven't recovered from that. And so these companies are stretched thin and there's a lot of competition. You have a very competitive retail market, which is crazy to say in the day and age of Amazon, but the retail market continues to take up a lot of development and construction business. So places like Fargo, Moorhead, and things like that, they're building retail. They can make good money building those little retail shops than they can building that patio style home. That's where the profit's going to be, so it's a lot harder. And then just a number and complexity of building codes is always going to be an issue. You hear about this a lot when you get to the border states, particularly around South Dakota and Iowa, where people are much rather going to build in South Dakota or Iowa just because there are a lot less codes and restrictions, which has kind of got to be a continued conversation with the state legislature. So impacts on housing in greater Minnesota, and I'm going to show you some really outdated slides just because it's changed so much, but no market for starter homes. That should say no market. It's rather, what do you want to call it? It's just, it doesn't cash flow, right? Risky rental market data and mortgage problems for dilapidated housing. These are kind of like the gaps in a normal marketplace that I feel like Otter County and other people are trying to figure out how to fill. So this first one, no market for starter homes, and this is what I mean by being really outdated. I made this in 2017, and I was like, well, starter home construction's probably around there, right? And that's probably not true at all. What is it now, 240? Good Lord. Yeah, so yeah, that's happening. So that's really high. And then the appraised value of the starter home after you're done is probably going to be less than that. The home affordability for a new labor force isn't anywhere near that. And so the whole market just falls apart. It just doesn't work without something to kind of keep it propped up and to help fill that gap. Again, these are uncomfortable conversations because we're asking for private and nonprofit partnership and government partnership. That isn't a partnership that's always been very robust. So this is a risky rental market one, and I think it's one that could further, again, this is probably should be like, what, $1,200 to $1,500 per month now to make rent multifamily housing development work, is this is what's required for monthly rent in a unit. This is what the median rent, according to the ACS in rural Minnesota were. And there was a big gap there. And a lot of times when you're talking about development, you know, they're coming up, they're like, oh, which rental here? So they'll pull up the data and be like, oh, God, that's nowhere near where we need it to be. I'm not building here. I would argue one thing that needs to be done is there's just been an ongoing culture of low rent in rural areas. It's not necessarily that they couldn't afford to pay more rent. It's just that they kind of refuse to, right? Why would you when you at times could buy a house for $100,000 and have a mortgage payment less than your rent, right? But that's not the case anymore. And I think a lot of rural regions are starting to recognize that we can charge $1,000 a month, and kind of the teachers and nurses that we're trying to recruit into these areas that are looking for maybe temporary housing for a year or two can afford that. It's not awesome, but that's just the way it has to be. So that's something I would challenge rural areas on, is just make a go of it, and I think there's people there that can afford to pay a little bit more. And then there's always a dilapidated housing issue too, where you might have some dilapidated housing in rural areas. Somebody wants to buy that house, build it up, but to get that loan to work, again, you're going to have an appraised value of the home after renovations that's less than what it took to purchase and renovate that house. And again, there's a gap in the mortgage and the loan fails. So that's kind of the big things, and I did include changing the story for high schoolers because I know you guys have some workshops talking about how do we increase the labor force in construction. And this is something I'm just really excited about and very passionate about, is how we start figuring out how to get our high school students engaged and involved in our labor force that's local. Now, keep in mind, how many minutes do I have, Sarah? Am I doing okay? Okay, 5 minutes. Here we go. We're going to fix high schoolers. So keep in mind that I hate using this word, the brain drain, right? But we all know what it is, and we all know what it references. Our best and brightest leave our rural regions. It's like, why stay in a rural region? I consider myself bright and best. But what the issue is is that used to be during a time when we encouraged our young people to maybe leave our rural regions because we thought they could find better pay, more opportunities in a place that wasn't local, right? Like that's what it was based on, particularly in the Rust Belt and Southeast United States where that is an issue. In Minnesota, not as much depending on where you are, but it was still an issue. We told our kids, yeah, take off. Our education system was kind of built on this idea of getting them prepped for college to take off somewhere and do something. But that's no longer the case, right? The whole entire labor force and career opportunities has completely flipped. And our rural regions now have tons of opportunities for our kids. But we still have an education system that values getting them to leave, that still kind of has this pipeline leading them out of our rural regions. It's starting to change, and it's exciting to see it change. And I'm really happy to see it. Two things I want to say in your workshop, you guys will hear this, is that it's going to take a full court press to get our students to change their perceptions about what their opportunities are in their rural region. And when we look at academic literature, there's two types of influences, right? So there's relationships that they have and the observations that they're making. Duh, right? Like that makes sense. But we really need to realize like how broad that is. So the relationships, you obviously have immediate family, that's a big one. How are we talking to our kids and the children that we know about the opportunities and what it's like to live here? Are we just constantly complaining about it? Or are we saying, hey, man, I love living here. I hope you could see, you should come to my job with me or whatever, right? Like we should be doing things like that. But then I would argue there's formal advisors in college admissions. Anybody here a formal advisor or college admission person? Or, right? Okay, good. So I would argue college admissions are salespeople. They're there to sell. And one good sales pitch that's worked really, really well since the 1970s is telling the kids, in particular first-generation college-bound students and their parents, that if they want their kids to succeed and not be poor and have the best opportunities, they need to get the heck out of this area. That has worked really, really well. The other one is formal advisors. So I know down in southwest Minnesota, I was talking to somebody and they like, oh yeah, we had a high school advisor who graduated from South Dakota State University Brookings. And once you know it, that's all she pushed was everybody to go to Brookings, South Dakota, and nowhere in southwest Minnesota, right? Because they were an alum there and they loved it there. And, well, they did severe damage to their region by letting this person do that, not be an objective person that was proud of where they lived and worked rather than where they graduated from. That's a big deal. That hurts. And it sucks. Then we have observations, right? So how are we telling them about career opportunities? And what are we doing in our communities? I would argue that for a long time, we haven't talked to our kids about being valued members of our communities. We just kind of expected them to leave. Yeah, we got you for 18 years and I hope you make it, right? And we'll see you later. Now it's like, hey, you know, we would love to have you in. Hey, have you ever thought about running for city council? Or, you know, whatever. Just get them involved in some of the decisions being made. We're not doing a great job at that. So, retention, engaging youth, it's going to take a whole lot of things. When we first started doing this research, a lot of folks were like, well, we had a regional job fair, right? And that's great. You should have a regional job fair. And I guarantee you those kids for those 24 hours were really excited. And they're like, man, there's a lot of cool stuff here. And then they went home and talked to their parents and their friends and advisors and got influenced in a different way, right? Because there's just all of this energy and resources pumped behind a different message. And so it's going to take a whole lot of stuff to get our kids to move in a different direction because we're working against 30 to 40 years of migration trends that are pretty set in stone. But it's working, and I think we're seeing good results from it, and I just encourage you to keep it up. Here's some of the cool stuff that's been happening. You could talk to me afterwards. I'm going to wrap up here. One last thing, though, is I got to talk about Build Dakota. You probably saw the news, North Dakota State University. Anybody see it was yesterday? Yeah, they're matching Minnesota, so if you go to NDSU and you're a Minnesota resident, they'll pay your tuition fees to match up with the North Star Promise of Minnesota, which they passed to waive tuition and fees if you're $80,000 or less in your home income. And this is all competing against Build Dakota out of South Dakota, which is allowing students from any state to come into South Dakota, go to a 2-year college there, and then work there for 3 years in South Dakota in an occupation considered in demand, and they'll waive your tuition and books. And they're actually sending postcards to people in South Minnesota. Come live in South Dakota. And they have a picture of Kristi Noem with a welding mask on and stuff. And $75,000, no taxes, land of the free, right? and it's a really clever and competitive marketing campaign. I would argue, like, good for them. They know what's up, right? We are behind on this. Why we're not doing stuff like this drives me nuts. And we have the infrastructure, we have great two-year colleges, we have philanthropy up the wazoo in Minnesota to do this kind of stuff. There should be nothing stopping us from doing it. The North Star Promise, I think, was a step in the absolute right direction. But the one thing, and I would encourage anybody talking to your legislator, it should have a work requirement on it. Right now, any student that gets this scholarship doesn't have to work in Minnesota after they graduate. And I find that to be a really bad idea, particularly for places like Moorhead, in Marshall, where they're going to go to college for free and can likely then just go to Fargo or Sioux Falls or Brookings to work. And that's not what we want in Minnesota. So with that, I have childcare. That's a big deal, just so you know. I think that's it. Yeah. I'll stand for questions. Yeah. I'll send it to Sarah. Sarah's on our board, on our board of directors at Center for Rural Policy and Development. So talk to her. I'll get it to her. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. I really appreciate it. Have a great day and keep up the good work here.